When most people think about the war in Ukraine, they imagine the tanks rolling across frozen fields, artillery pounding trenches in the Donbass, or missile strikes lighting up cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv. But few realize that far from those land battles, another war is raging, one that could decide not only the fate of Ukraine, but also the balance of power across Europe and the world. Because the Black Sea, a body of water often overlooked in global affairs, has suddenly become the center of a struggle with consequences that ripple from Africa to Asia, from NATO capitals to the halls of the Kremlin. And in this hidden battleground, Ukraine and Russia are fighting a high-stakes contest where ships, ports, trade routes, and even food supplies have become weapons. And what happens here could tip the outcome of the entire war, and perhaps even reshape the future of naval warfare itself. Because this is not just a battle of warships and submarines. It is a battle of innovation, resilience, and survival, a showdown in which Ukraine has managed to challenge Russia's mighty fleet without even having a conventional navy of its own, relying instead on ingenuity, precision strikes, and new technologies that have shocked military analysts around the world. And yet the stakes go far beyond missiles and drones, because whoever controls the Black Sea controls Ukraine's economic lifeline, the flow of grain and trade that feeds millions of people worldwide. And by blockading ports and targeting Odesa, Russia has turned the sea into a weapon of global pressure, creating food shortages in Africa and the Middle East, driving up prices, and using hunger as leverage against the West. While Ukraine fights not only for its sovereignty, but also for the principle that no nation should be able to starve the world into submission. And this is why the Black Sea matters to all of us, why a struggle in waters thousands of miles away can affect the bread on our tables, the stability of our alliances, and the security of our future. And as we peel back the layers of this conflict, we will see how the Black Sea has become the most dangerous chessboard in the world, a place where every move could ignite escalation, where NATO, Russia, and Ukraine stand at the edge of confrontation, and where the lessons being learned are already reshaping the way wars will be fought for decades to come. Because this is more than just another chapter of the Ukraine war. This is the Black Sea showdown, a battle for survival, influence, and the very rules that hold our world together. From ancient times, the Black Sea has stood as more than just a body of water. It has been a gateway, a trade route, and a battlefield for empires seeking to expand their power and secure their survival. And in today's world, it has become one of the most contested spaces on Earth, where Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and regional players constantly struggle for control, knowing that whoever dominates this sea also controls critical trade corridors, military routes, and the balance of power in Eastern Europe and beyond. And when the war in Ukraine erupted in 2014 and escalated in 2022, the Black Sea immediately transformed into a frontline, a theater where naval blockades, drone attacks, grain shipments, and geopolitical calculations all collided, making the sea not just a geographical feature, but a symbol of global struggle. And to understand why control of this sea matters so deeply, we must go back in history, because the Black Sea has always been a crossroads where civilizations clashed and empires rose and fell. From the Greeks, who established colonies on its coasts, to the Byzantines, who relied on it for defense and trade, to the Ottomans, who for centuries made it their internal sea. And finally to the Russian Empire, which saw access to the Black Sea as the key to survival and expansion. For without warm water ports, Russia would remain landlocked and vulnerable. And this obsession with reaching the Black Sea has defined Russian strategy for centuries, driving wars against the Ottomans, against European coalitions, and shaping conflicts that echo into the present day. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Moscow did not lose this obsession. It simply entered a new phase, where NATO's eastward expansion and Ukraine's independence threatened Russia's ability to project power over the Black Sea. And in 2014, when Crimea was annexed, it was not simply about territory, it was about Sevastopol, the crown jewel naval base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the only port that allowed Russia to operate year-round in the Mediterranean, Middle East, and beyond.
So the annexation was as much strategic as political, ensuring that Moscow retained its naval lifeline. And when the full-scale war began in 2022, the Black Sea once again became central, as Russia sought to blockade Ukrainian ports like Odesa to strangle Kiev's economy, while Ukraine, despite having a weaker navy, used innovative tactics, missiles and drones to sink Russian warships and challenge Moscow's dominance, proving that in the modern age, naval superiority can be contested not just with ships, but with technology. And as the war dragged on, the world realized that the Black Sea mattered far beyond Russia and Ukraine, because it became the epicenter of a global food crisis. Since Ukraine's grain exports, which feed millions in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, could not leave safely without access to the sea, and Russia's blockade threatened to starve nations dependent on those shipments, forcing Turkey, the UN, and other players to negotiate fragile grain deals, showing how the fate of farmers in Ukraine could ripple into the lives of families thousands of miles away. And at the same time, the Black Sea became a testing ground for NATO's strategy, with Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey on one side, Russia on the other, and Ukraine fighting for survival in between, creating one of the most dangerous flashpoints in modern geopolitics, a space where a single naval incident could spiral into direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. And the world watches with unease as ships shadow one another, aircraft buzz over contested waters, and submarines lurk unseen, reminding us that this sea is not just about Ukraine's war, it is about global stability. Because control of the Black Sea means control of access to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus, and whoever holds that key can influence Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Which is why empires fought over it for centuries, and why the struggle today carries echoes of past wars, as history once again converges on the waters of the Black Sea, where the clash of ambition, survival, and global order is being decided in real time. As the war in Ukraine continued to unfold after 2022, the Black Sea quickly became not only a military battleground, but also a stage where diplomacy, economics, and technology all collided, because Russia's initial assumption was that it could dominate the sea through its Black Sea fleet and quickly shut down Ukraine's maritime access. But Ukraine's resilience and creative use of missiles like the Neptune and Western-supplied weapons such as the Harpoon proved that even a smaller and weaker navy could inflict serious damage on a much larger fleet. And the dramatic sinking of the Moskva, Russia's flagship cruiser, sent shockwaves through the region and around the world, proving that Russian dominance was not absolute, and that the age of uncontested naval supremacy had given way to a new era where drones, missiles, and asymmetric tactics could level the playing field. And this development had broader implications because it meant that NATO, observing closely, understood that the Black Sea could not be left solely to traditional fleets. It required investment in coastal defense, intelligence sharing, and technology to counter Russia's ambitions, while Moscow realized that it could no longer operate with impunity, forcing it to pull many ships further east to avoid being destroyed, which in turn limited its ability to project power into the Mediterranean, showing that the balance in the Black Sea was far more fragile than many assumed. And while this military contest played out, the economic dimension grew even more critical, because Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil, and its ports on the Black Sea, such as Odesa, Chornomorsk, and Mykolaiv, were lifelines for global food markets. And when Russia blockaded them, prices soared worldwide, threatening food security from Cairo to Lagos to Dhaka. And the pressure mounted on the international community to find a solution, which led to the fragile Black Sea Grain Initiative brokered by Turkey and the United Nations, an agreement that allowed limited safe passage of Ukrainian grain ships under strict inspection and monitoring. But this deal was always vulnerable, depending on Moscow's cooperation, and Russia repeatedly threatened to withdraw or imposed conditions, using food as a weapon of leverage not just against Ukraine, but against the West and developing nations, creating a global hostage situation where hungry populations far from Europe were drawn into the consequences of the Black Sea showdown. And in this environment, Turkey emerged as a pivotal player, because its control of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles under the Montreux Convention of 1936 gave it the power to regulate the passage of warships between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, meaning that Turkey effectively acted as a gatekeeper, balancing its NATO membership with its close economic ties to Russia, playing mediator in grain talks while also selling drones to Ukraine, a delicate dance that elevated Ankara's role on the world stage. And for Russia, this dependence on Turkish cooperation highlighted the vulnerability of its Black Sea position, because while it could blockade Ukraine, it could not escape the reality that access to the Mediterranean depended on Turkey's willingness to allow or restrict naval traffic, creating a strategic bottleneck that Moscow could not control. And meanwhile, NATO's Black Sea members, Romania and Bulgaria, became increasingly important staging grounds for surveillance and intelligence operations, hosting allied forces and serving as hubs for Western military support to Ukraine. And Romania, in particular, with its long coastline and proximity to Odesa, became a frontline state in everything but name, aware that any escalation in the Black Sea could drag it into direct conflict. And this fragile balance of military maneuvers, economic blockades, and diplomatic negotiations turned the Black Sea into a high-stakes chessboard where every move had global consequences. But beneath the surface, another layer of competition emerged: the struggle for energy routes. Because the Black Sea is not only a trade highway, but also a resource-rich basin with pipelines and offshore reserves that feed Europe. And Russia long sought to control these flows to maintain its energy dominance, while Ukraine, Romania, and even Western companies eyed the potential of offshore gas to diversify Europe's supplies, creating yet another flashpoint in an already tense environment. And as sanctions squeezed Moscow, it turned increasingly to the Black Sea as a critical export corridor, not only for grain, but for oil and gas shipments rerouted to new markets like India and China, reinforcing the fact that whoever dominates these waters wields a lever of economic influence stretching across continents. And for Ukraine, survival depended on keeping at least some maritime access alive, because a landlocked Ukraine would face permanent economic strangulation, a reality that made every missile strike on Odesa's port infrastructure not just a military act, but an attack on Ukraine's long-term viability. And thus, the Black Sea struggle became existential, not just about controlling waters, but about determining whether Ukraine could remain a functioning state integrated into global markets, or whether Russia could trap it into dependence and isolation. And as months turned into years, the world came to see that the Black Sea was not a side theater of the war, it was the war's central artery, the place where military clashes, food crises, energy struggles, and global diplomacy all converged, making the outcome of this contest a decisive factor in shaping the future of Europe, the Middle East, and the global order itself. As the war dragged into its second year, the Black Sea evolved into a battleground not only of ships and missiles, but of strategy, technology, and psychology. Because Russia still claimed dominance with its larger fleet, but Ukraine had shown that even without a conventional navy, it could strike fear into Moscow by using long-range missiles, drones, and Western intelligence to attack Russian vessels, ports, and supply depots, turning what was once considered a Russian-controlled sea into contested waters where every movement carried risk. And the psychological effect of this was enormous, as Russian sailors became wary of venturing too close to Ukraine's coast, while Ukraine's success inspired smaller nations around the world who saw proof that naval supremacy could be challenged by innovation rather than sheer size. And at the same time, NATO intelligence aircraft and surveillance drones constantly patrolled the skies over the Black Sea, gathering data and feeding Ukraine critical information, making the sea one of the most heavily monitored bodies of water in the world. And this relentless observation meant that any Russian attempt to escalate risked immediate detection, further limiting Moscow's freedom of maneuver. And yet, Russia still retained the ability to strike Ukrainian port infrastructure with missiles and drones, turning Odesa into a frontline city where every night explosions shook the sky, threatening not only Ukraine's economy, but also the global food supply that depended on these ports. And in this way, the Black Sea became a weapon in Russia's hybrid war strategy, not just a military tool but an economic and political one, because by blockading grain shipments and striking silos, Russia sent ripples into Africa and the Middle East, creating hunger and unrest that could weaken Western influence in those regions and increase Moscow's leverage, while simultaneously presenting Russia as willing to offer grain deals to friendly nations, portraying itself as a benefactor even while causing the crisis, a cynical but effective manipulation of global perceptions. And in this contest, Ukraine tried to flip the narrative by showing the world that it was fighting not only for its sovereignty, but also for the right of millions of people to eat, a powerful moral argument that won its sympathy and support. Yet behind these narratives, the hard reality remained that control of the Black Sea was about survival, because whoever held the sea lanes held Ukraine's economic future and Russia's ability to pressure Europe. And this is why Western analysts warned that the Black Sea showdown was not an isolated struggle but a test of NATO's credibility. For if Russia managed to secure uncontested dominance, it would be able to intimidate not only Ukraine, but also Romania, Bulgaria, and even Turkey, undermining NATO's security architecture in the region. While Ukraine managed to keep challenging Moscow and reopen maritime access, it would prove that Russia's influence could be contained and that smaller nations could survive even under immense pressure. And so the stakes rose higher with every month, while new forms of warfare continued to redefine the conflict, especially the rise of naval drones, small unmanned boats packed with explosives that Ukraine began deploying against Russian ships and port facilities, catching Moscow off guard and forcing it to adapt to a threat it had not anticipated. And the effectiveness of these drones suggested a future where naval warfare might be transformed entirely, where billion-dollar warships could be neutralized by cheap, remotely operated craft. A nightmare for traditional navies, but a lifeline for Ukraine. And once again, the Black Sea served as a laboratory for the future of warfare, showing the world how innovation and desperation could change the rules of battle. And as both sides escalated their tactics, the regional players were forced to navigate the dangers of living next to such a volatile sea, with Romania repeatedly finding debris from Russian missiles and drones on its territory, a reminder of how close NATO itself was to being dragged directly into the conflict, and Turkey continuing its delicate balancing act, knowing that its unique control of the Bosphorus made it both powerful and vulnerable, while countries like Georgia watched nervously, aware that the Black Sea's storms of war could one day sweep them into conflict as well. And beyond the region, the great powers calculated their positions, with the United States and European allies pouring resources into shoring up Ukraine's ability to resist, while Russia sought to deepen ties with China and Iran to offset its isolation. And all the while, the Black Sea remained the theater where these global strategies converged. A stage too important to ignore because it determined not only who would win or lose in Ukraine, but also whether the international order would bend toward Western rules or Russian defiance, making every battle, every blockade, and every grain shipment a piece of a much larger struggle for the shape of the future world.
As the conflict pressed on into yet another phase, the Black Sea transformed from a regional theater of war into a symbol of a larger global struggle between authoritarian force and the rules-based order. Because its waters were no longer just about Ukraine and Russia, but about the balance of power across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. And as every missile strike, drone attack, or blockade rattled the region, nations far away from the shoreline felt the tremors, whether it was African countries struggling with grain shortages or European states recalculating their energy routes and defense budgets. And this interconnectedness made the Black Sea a critical fault line where local battles had worldwide consequences. So the question became not simply who controlled the sea today, but who would shape the rules of tomorrow. And in this sense, the showdown evolved into a test of endurance, because Russia sought to outlast Ukraine and its Western supporters by grinding down infrastructure and morale, while Ukraine relied on innovation, resilience, and international aid to keep the fight alive. And in this contest, the Black Sea stood as both prize and battlefield, a body of water that could unlock trade or enforce isolation. And while Russia kept attempting to use its fleet as leverage, Ukraine continued finding ways to strike back, even reaching into Crimea with daring operations that shook Moscow's sense of security, proving that the sea could not be locked down entirely. And as the world watched these bold moves, the narrative shifted slowly toward one of Ukrainian defiance and creativity rather than Russian invincibility. And this mattered enormously because wars are fought not only on battlefields, but in the perception of publics and leaders who decide whether to continue investing resources. And if Ukraine could demonstrate that even a seemingly weaker nation could contest one of the world's strongest militaries at sea, then Western governments had greater justification to sustain their support, while Russia needed to project the opposite, that it was inevitable, unshakable, and firmly in control of its maritime domain, a narrative it struggled to maintain in the face of Ukrainian successes. And in this tug of war over perception, the Black Sea became both weapon and weakness, a space where victories were amplified globally and failures magnified to the point of strategic significance. And as the months turned to years, analysts warned that the eventual outcome of this struggle would determine not only Ukraine's survival, but also NATO's credibility. Because if Russia managed to secure unchallenged dominance and enforce its will across the sea, then the alliance's southern flank would be permanently under pressure. But if Ukraine, with NATO's backing, managed to keep Moscow in check and reopen maritime access, then the West would prove that aggression could be contained, thereby reinforcing the security of every nation bordering the alliance. And this larger consequence is why the Black Sea showdown cannot be dismissed as a distant regional fight, for it is at its heart a battle for the principles of free trade, sovereignty, and international law. And the longer it drags on, the more it accelerates changes in naval strategy worldwide. Because militaries from Asia to Latin America are studying Ukraine's use of naval drones, missiles, and asymmetric tactics, realizing that the old era of uncontested carrier groups and battleship fleets might be coming to an end, replaced by a new paradigm where agility, intelligence, and unmanned systems dictate outcomes at sea. And in this way, the Black Sea is not only deciding the future of Eastern Europe, but perhaps previewing the wars of the 21st century. And as the war grinds forward, one thing has become clear, that the Black Sea will not return to being a quiet backwater anytime soon, because its waters have been permanently politicized, militarized, and internationalized. And no matter who eventually gains the upper hand, the lessons learned here will shape naval doctrines, trade security, and geopolitical calculations for decades to come. And so the showdown continues, with Ukraine striking, Russia retaliating, NATO monitoring, and the world watching, knowing that beyond the smoke of missile strikes and the splash of naval drones lies a contest that will influence whether Europe can remain whole and free, whether authoritarian powers can rewrite borders through force, and whether the seas that connect nations will remain open highways of commerce or weapons of coercion. And in the end, the story of the Black Sea is not merely about ships and ports, but about the future of global order itself. Because in this confined body of water, history is being written, and the waves crashing against Odesa, Sevastopol, and Constanza carry with them the echoes of a struggle that will define the century. Even as the war continues to rage, the Black Sea is no longer viewed only as a contested waterway between Russia and Ukraine, but as the beating heart of a much broader geopolitical confrontation that draws in NATO, the European Union, Turkey, and even distant players like China and India, because what happens here determines not just the survival of Ukraine, but also the credibility of Western promises and the stability of global trade. And this reality has forced governments across the globe to reassess how vital the sea truly is, as every grain shipment halted or missile strike launched sends tremors across food markets, energy prices, and diplomatic alliances.
And in this way, the Black Sea has become both a weapon and a warning, showing how fragile the arteries of globalization are when one regional war can ripple into global hunger and inflation. And yet at the same time, it has become a stage where new alliances and rivalries are forged, because Turkey's control of the Bosphorus gives it leverage far greater than its size, allowing it to act as both mediator and power broker, while Romania and Bulgaria suddenly find themselves on the front lines of NATO's eastern defense, drawing American and European troops, warships, and surveillance planes into their territory, transforming quiet coastal cities into hubs of international military activity. And for these countries, the Black Sea is no longer just a border, but a potential battlefield, a place where any miscalculation could bring NATO into direct conflict with Russia. And this is why Western strategists emphasize that the struggle is not only about territory or ports, but about deterrence, because the longer Ukraine manages to resist and disrupt Russia's naval superiority, the more it signals to authoritarian powers worldwide that aggression will be costly and contested. But if Moscow eventually crushes Ukraine's ability to use the sea, then others may conclude that the West lacks the resolve to defend its principles, a perception that would embolden not only Russia, but also countries like China as they eye contested waters such as the South China Sea or even Taiwan's maritime approaches. And thus, the Black Sea becomes a mirror reflecting larger global struggles, a smaller but no less significant front in a worldwide contest over the future of power, order, and sovereignty. And yet, for the people living along its shores, the war is not an abstract debate about principles, but a daily reality of fear, uncertainty, and resilience. As fishermen in Odesa weigh the risks of sailing too close to mined waters, families in Sevastopol live under the shadow of constant militarization, and farmers in southern Ukraine wonder whether the grain they harvest will ever leave the ports to reach markets in Africa and Asia. And these human stories add another layer to the Black Sea's significance, reminding the world that behind every statistic of tons of grain lost or ships destroyed lie millions of lives disrupted. And this humanitarian dimension makes the fight for the sea even more urgent, because it is not only about strategy but also about survival. As aid organizations warn of hunger crises triggered by blocked exports, Ukraine uses the moral weight of these consequences to rally support, portraying itself as the defender not only of European freedom, but also of global food security, an argument that resonates powerfully in nations far from the battlefield, especially in Africa and the Middle East, where bread prices are directly tied to Ukrainian grain. And this is why Russia's blockade is not just a regional tactic, but a global pressure tool. Because by weaponizing food, Moscow attempts to fracture Western alliances and gain influence in the global South, offering selective deals and shipments in exchange for loyalty or neutrality. And this manipulation turns the Black Sea into a chessboard where the pieces are not only warships and missiles, but also sacks of wheat and barrels of oil, making the struggle multifaceted and deeply entrenched in the fabric of international politics. And as the war stretches on, new technologies keep reshaping the battlefield, with naval drones growing more advanced, anti-ship missiles extending their reach, and cyber operations increasingly targeting navigation systems, signaling that the Black Sea is not just a theater of conventional warfare, but a testing ground for hybrid tactics that combine digital disruption with physical force. And this innovation race makes the conflict unpredictable, because while Russia still holds numerical advantage, Ukraine's ingenuity and Western backing allow it to offset weaknesses and strike unexpected blows, keeping the battle uncertain and preventing Moscow from declaring absolute control. And this uncertainty itself is a form of victory for Kyiv, for as long as Russia cannot secure the sea fully, it cannot impose its will economically or politically. And as long as Ukraine can keep the fight alive, the West has reason to remain engaged, while Moscow must continue investing resources into defending a maritime front that it once assumed would be uncontested, draining its capacity for operations elsewhere. And in this grinding contest, the future of the Black Sea will likely be decided not in a single dramatic battle, but through attrition, innovation, and diplomacy, as each side pushes to outlast the other, waiting to see whose endurance collapses first. And the world watches because it knows that the outcome will echo far beyond these waters, shaping the direction of international order in the 21st century.
As the Black Sea war zone matures, the conflict is increasingly defined by scenarios of what could come next, rather than simply what is happening now. Because both Russia and Ukraine understand that the struggle for control of these waters will be long, fluid, and shaped by unpredictable factors. And one of the most critical questions is whether Russia can sustain its naval presence in the face of repeated Ukrainian strikes. Because although Moscow still controls major bases in Crimea, including Sevastopol, the vulnerability of these sites has been laid bare by daring Ukrainian operations that have struck air defenses, fuel depots, and even parts of the fleet itself. And each successful attack chips away at the image of Russian invincibility, raising doubts among its own sailors and emboldening Ukraine to press further. And yet Russia still retains formidable missile systems, submarines, and long-range strike capabilities, making the battle uneven and costly for Kiev, which must rely on ingenuity and limited Western-supplied weaponry. And this imbalance raises the specter of escalation, because if Russia feels cornered, it may seek to use more destructive methods, perhaps intensifying missile barrages on port cities or laying denser minefields to prevent Ukraine from expanding its maritime activity. And such escalation would not remain confined to Ukraine, as NATO states bordering the sea would be drawn further into defensive postures, increasing surveillance, hosting more allied warships, and potentially becoming involved in incidents where debris or stray strikes cross into their territories. And each of these flashpoints risks spiraling into something larger, making the Black Sea a constant tinderbox. And at the same time, the diplomatic dimension grows more pressing, because Turkey remains the gatekeeper of the Bosphorus, and its decisions to restrict or allow certain vessels carry enormous weight. And while Ankara has so far walked a tightrope, maintaining relations with both Russia and the West, the longer the war drags on, the harder it becomes to balance these competing interests. And this delicate act underscores how the Black Sea is not only a military theater, but also a political one, where negotiations, grain deals, and ceasefire talks intersect. And this gives outside powers like the United States, the European Union, and even the United Nations leverage to influence outcomes. But it also gives Russia opportunities to exploit divisions, as Moscow offers grain or energy concessions to weaker states in hopes of undermining unified Western pressure. And thus, the showdown is fought not only with missiles and drones, but also with diplomacy and propaganda, each side seeking to claim the moral high ground and portray itself as the defender of international stability. And in this struggle, Ukraine has often managed to appeal to a wider audience by framing itself as the underdog fighting for survival and for the rights of millions of hungry people across the world, while Russia seeks to depict itself as the victim of Western encirclement and sanctions, a narrative it pushes aggressively in the global South, where memories of colonialism make some governments more receptive to anti-Western arguments. And this global information war makes the Black Sea even more consequential, because it is not simply a battleground of geography, but also a symbol in the worldwide contest over narratives, alliances, and influence. And as the war lengthens, analysts warn that fatigue could set in among Western populations, raising the risk that support for Ukraine might weaken. And if that happens, Russia could consolidate control of the sea by default, proving that endurance can outmatch innovation. But on the other hand, if Ukraine manages to keep striking at Russian ships, reopening export routes, and holding Western attention, then Moscow may find its naval dominance eroded to the point where it can no longer dictate events, forcing it to seek compromise or risk outright defeat at sea. And this balance of endurance versus innovation will likely decide the course of the Black Sea conflict in the years ahead. Looking further into the future, the Black Sea showdown offers multiple scenarios, each carrying profound consequences not only for Ukraine and Russia, but for the world. Because one possible outcome is that Russia entrenches its control, holding Crimea, dominating the sea lanes, and keeping Ukraine's economy strangled indefinitely. A scenario that would embolden Moscow, discourage Western allies, and signal to other authoritarian powers that military aggression pays off. But another possibility is that Ukraine, with sustained Western support, continues its campaign of attrition against Russia's fleet, gradually degrading its naval power to the point where Moscow is forced to retreat further from contested waters, thereby reopening trade corridors and proving that resistance can triumph even against a stronger adversary. And in such a case, the Black Sea would become a symbol of resilience and inspire other small nations facing larger threats. And yet a third possibility lies somewhere in between, with neither side able to secure full control, resulting in a prolonged stalemate where the sea remains contested, trade sporadic, and risks constant. And this middle ground may in fact be the most likely scenario because it reflects the reality that neither Russia nor Ukraine has the means to secure total victory at sea without either massive escalation or a fundamental shift in international involvement. And this ongoing contest would keep the Black Sea locked in tension, shaping global politics for years as a flashpoint that could ignite at any moment. And beyond these immediate outcomes lies the question of how the conflict will reshape naval strategy worldwide. Because the effectiveness of Ukrainian drones, missiles, and intelligence has already sent shockwaves through military planning circles, showing that small, cheap technologies can humble powerful fleets. And this lesson is being studied not only by Western navies, but also by China, Iran, and others, each recalculating the risks of investing in large warships that may be vulnerable to asymmetric strikes. And if this lesson takes root, then the future of naval warfare could be transformed, with swarms of unmanned vessels, cyber attacks, and long-range precision missiles replacing the grand fleets of old, a revolution that began in the waters of the Black Sea. And thus, even if Ukraine does not regain full control, its innovations may already have changed the balance of global power, giving smaller nations tools to defend themselves against stronger rivals. And in this sense, the Black Sea showdown transcends its immediate stakes, because it is not only about who holds Odesa or Sevastopol, but also about who defines the rules of war, trade, and sovereignty in the 21st century, and whether the seas will remain open highways of commerce or instruments of coercion. And this is why leaders, strategists, and ordinary citizens far from the region cannot afford to look away, because the future being written in these waters will shape their own lives in ways they may not yet realize, from the price of bread on supermarket shelves to the security of shipping routes in Asia. And in the end, the Black Sea has become more than a sea. It has become a mirror reflecting the struggle of our age, a struggle between force and law, between dominance and freedom, and its outcome will echo across the world long after the last missile falls into its waves.